So welcome to the Daily Brief on Metro Milwaukee's health and the economy, brought to you by the Medical College of Wisconsin and the Metropolitan Milwaukee Association of Commerce. I'm Tim Sheehy, president of the MMAC, and I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. John Raymond. Each day at 3:30, we deliver a 19-minute fact-filled update on health and economic prosperity of the region and the impact of COVID-19. This webcast is powered by Aurora WDC. Our special guest today is Lisa Johnson, president of BioForward Wisconsin, and she's going to talk about how her members have helped supply solutions in COVID testing. So with that, we'll kick off with our healthcare update from Dr. Raymond.
Thanks, Tim, and good afternoon, everybody. The first slide shows various indicators of COVID-19, and I'll run through these quickly. The doubling time for COVID-19 in Wisconsin continues to stretch out now to 13.5 days and 19 days in Milwaukee. The daily growth rates over the last 7 days also are stable at 4.5% in Wisconsin and 3% in Milwaukee. Positive tests in Wisconsin dropped to 8.6% yesterday or today and 12% in Milwaukee. The number of positive tests in Wisconsin were 330 and in Milwaukee 57. And the testing capacity in Wisconsin is stable. ICU and ventilator capacity are adequate and stable, and the PPE trends are stable. And you can find most of this information updated daily on the MMAC's Wisconsin Health and Economy dashboard. Next slide, please. This slide again shows that the statewide capacity to test for COVID-19 infections, as shown by the blue line, has increased significantly over the last 2 weeks, with daily testing capacity now at nearly 11,400, which is approaching the goal of at least 85,000 tests per week. The type of test displayed here is the PCR test for the COVID-19 virus RNA. Now, I'd like to also spend a few moments discussing serology testing that measures antibodies that are part of the immune response to individuals to COVID-19. And recall that the immune response to COVID-19 is rather delayed, and the antibodies might not be detectable reliably until 14 days after symptoms develop. And today I'll discuss briefly with you the two most reliable tests on the market, and these could be considered the gold standards. Next slide, please. The ABBOTT test is now broadly available, having received FDA emergency use authorization several weeks ago. It measures IgG and requires a blood draw.
Oh, we lost your sound.
Dr. Raymond, I believe we lost your sound. Sorry about that.
I'm sorry, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, I'll start again with the ABBOTT test. It's broadly available and it received FDA emergency use authorization several weeks ago, and it measures IgG and it requires a blood draw. Now, the test is 100% sensitive, meaning that there are virtually no false negative tests when conducted 14 days after a positive PCR test, and the test is 99.6% specific. What that means is there would only be 4 false positive tests per 1,000 samples. Now, it can also be performed in less than 30 minutes with a capacity of 100 to 200 tests per hour, and it's said to not cross-react with other coronaviruses. Next slide, please. Now, the ROCHE test received FDA emergency use authorization last week, and it has a similar profile to the ABBOTT test, but it measures a mix of IgG, IgA, and IgM. And it also has slightly better specificity with only 2 false positive tests per 1,000 and a slightly higher throughput than the ABBOTT test. Next slide, please. This slide summarizes the differences between PCR testing and the antibody tests. As you can see on the left with the blue line and the dotted green line, the COVID-19 protein and RNA can be detected during an infection, but those trail off as the infection resolves and the immune response begins to develop. IgM peaks relatively early, as shown by the dashed pink line, and trails off as IgG, or the more permanent, durable immune response, begins to peak at about 14 days out from the positive PCR test, as shown by the tan line. Now, the most important take-home message about antibody tests is that the ABBOTT and ROCHE tests are far superior to the tests that were used to estimate the prevalence of COVID-19 in Santa Clara and in Los Angeles. Now, why do I say that? If we could go to the next slide, please. Recall that specificity measures false positive tests. When the disease prevalence is low, specificity is more critical than when the prevalence is high. So, for example, let's assume a 98% specificity or a 2% false positive rate. That sounds pretty good, right? Well, maybe not. Let's consider two scenarios. In scenario one, there's a low prevalence of COVID-19. Let's say the prevalence is 1% in the population. Now, the test will detect that 1% plus the 2% false positives. That would result in a rate of 3% positive tests, which would overstate the prevalence by 200%. On the other hand, in scenario two, with a high prevalence of COVID-19, let's say 50%, the test would detect the 50% true positives and 2% false positives. And the rate of 52% only slightly exaggerates the prevalence of 50%. And that's the reason why the LA and Santa Clara studies are flawed. They didn't use these gold standard tests. They used antibody tests that had a higher false positive rate. So what's the cost of having lower false positive rates? You know, the ABBOTT and ROCHE platforms are very expensive and very complex. And before turning it back over to Tim, I'd just like to show you a video of the ROCHE unit in the Wisconsin Diagnostic Laboratory at Freighter, just to illustrate the complexity of the instrument. Thanks, Eric. The video's done.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Raymond. And I'm going to bring Lisa in here, the president of BioForward Wisconsin. And as we've talked about this over time, testing not only in the current state, but also into the next normal is going to be critically important. And Lisa, you have a lot of members at the forefront of this. So I want you to talk a little bit about BioForward Wisconsin, what some of your members are doing, and the frustration that exists over testing here in Wisconsin.
That sounds good. Thank you so much, Tim, for having me. Yeah, if we go to my slide, I don't know if that can be popped up. Go past my picture. I can talk a little bit about BioForward just quickly. BioForward is a member-driven association, what we call representing Wisconsin's biohealth industry. And that means anything from the research institutions, all the way up to patient care. So we have a variety of companies, whether it's GE Healthcare, Promega, Exact Sciences, some companies maybe that you've heard of are members of our organization. We do advocacy, we're very initiative oriented. We have a national talent campaign, purchasing consortium that's also involved in the PPE front. And of course, we promote Wisconsin, our industry, our supply chain, and then we have biohealth events. So if you can go to the next slide. Although this is not a picture of COVID, I'm tired of looking at a COVID virus. This is actually pluripotent stem cells. I just thought it was a cool picture and I thought everyone might like that. So really, why is BioForward? What is our role in the COVID-19 testing? I talked briefly about some of our member companies. So it really is trying to bring together our biohealth companies and our research institutions and uniting them, and how could we do a better job of confronting this COVID-19 crisis. We certainly have some frustration right now by a lot of our member companies where we feel we have many capabilities that could expand testing in this state that haven't been utilized. And so we are trying to pull those companies together along with some of our research institutions. And I can get into some of that in just a minute. But I'll just touch on that final bullet point. The other thing that we do is advocacy, where as we are in this COVID-19, there could be things that come out of it that are not aspects that we want happening, just whether it's our companies or to our research institutions. For instance, with PPE, when we had entities coming together to develop N95, your mask force in the Milwaukee area is a great example. We don't want any liability issues later on, so we worked with the legislature to make sure there was exclusion from liability. So just wanted to mention that quickly. So a little bit about where we think we should be going as a state on the testing front. I think it's great what MMAC is doing, trying to bring out how do we start up this economy. And to do that, though, as you are hearing in the news all over the place, we need expanded testing before that really could be effective. And when you just think about it as just your own individual, as a consumer, there isn't anything, if we just stopped safe at home today, we'd all go, okay, I feel great. I'm just going to go out and I don't care about social distancing, anything. No, all of us would be saying, now, wait a minute. I wonder if that person's been tested. Do they have it? Have they had it? And so if we can start to have expanded testing in place, we as consumers will build that confidence. So I kind of think of it as unlocking a door. There's like two keys that are really going to unlock the economy for us. One is vaccines. And it is doing, we have so many companies that are working in that area, including a local company in Wisconsin called FluGen, that if we can have the vaccines in place, you know, that virus comes into our body, it goes into the cell and it's going to stop, right? It can't replicate. That vaccine is going to stop it and then I can't transmit it. So right there, that's going to help our economy, right? Because now I have confidence I can go out if everyone's being vaccinated. But we aren't there yet, right? They're even starting to manufacture the vaccines to be prepared if they come through. The second key to unlock the economy is the testing. So I was just hearing recently, and because we had brought it up in a conversation with our companies, is they want a federal czar to take over testing and start implementing this on a national level. Well, we've been promoting at the state or within our organization that we want this state to have a healthcare czar that just goes after testing. And there's multiple ways you can go after testing. Dr. Raymond was telling you about the antibody testing. And what you're hearing from the state right now is the PCR testing that he was also showing the stats on, or you'll hear them say diagnostic testing, same thing. And it's great that we're increasing the capacity of diagnostic testing, and our member companies are involved in that. And Exact Sciences did an excellent job of pivoting their organization to be able to do that testing. Promega is one of the top 5 reagent companies in the world that is supplying reagents for our testing kits. So and then UW Health, it was involved in this, UW-Madison. So it's great that we are expanding our capacity on testing, but if you also looked at Dr. Raymond's chart, right now they're only testing symptomatic individuals. So our rate is still below like 2,000 people a day. So we're not hitting capacity. Capacity doesn't mean anything if we can't be testing that many or having so many tests done that, again, we're all confident. So we would like the state to start advancing and start convening more companies that are demonstrating that they have other capabilities. Could we do early screening? Could we even expand this diagnostic capability where we're actually doing the testing? And then, as Dr. Raymond was saying, going into the antibody testing, because what we're going to need to be doing eventually is we're going to be having to have the PCR, the diagnostic test. Do I have the virus? Am I in the early stage? Am I in the later stage and I'm starting to develop antibodies? Or do I already have the antibodies, thus I've already had the COVID itself? So we would like to see the state bring in more of our biohealth companies and our research institutions that keep coming to BioForward saying we can do more in the state, and we would like to see a healthcare czar just take over the testing and start to be able to push this out to a greater extent. The federal government has its own issues. They're trying to move faster, but a state can move even faster. And Wisconsin, unlike many states, does not have the capabilities we do. We have some of the top research institutions in the United States sitting in this state, as well as a broad expanse of biohealth companies that could start to do more on the testing front. So I know I talked for a long time there, Tim, but
okay.
I just wanted to put an opinion out there. If I could just mention one company before I get a question, I just want to give an example of a local company called Isomark that has a breathalyzer test. That if this state would just listen to some of us, that would start to say, well, what are some innovative companies that are out there? Because right now the federal government is pushing through innovation at a rapid rate. Isomark has an instrument where you breathe into it, and it can detect the virus 1 to 2 days before you would even become symptomatic. And that is when we're transmitting the virus to other people. So there's an example of, if we can just start to have some of these other companies that are based in Wisconsin and our government's listening to that, could we do more and expand testing even more than many other states? And as you've been promoting, Tim, get this economy up and running sooner rather than later.
Thank you, Lisa. Great insights. Dr. Raymond, we'll bring you back into the picture, and Chris will go to questions.
Yeah, we did have one question on something Lisa just touched on, is the difference between our testing capacity and the number of tests we're actually performing. What accounts for not using all the capacity that we have right now?
Well, I'll say a couple of things, and Dr. Raymond can jump in. One thing, we're only testing on symptomatic individuals. We are not testing for someone like me that maybe I've had it and I was asymptomatic, but they are not saying I can go do a drive-through and go get tested right now. They're staying with symptomatic. The other thing we are having issues with, there are sometimes reagent issues on these diagnostic kits that there's not enough of supply that is limiting the ability to perform the number of test kits, the capacity. So I do get frustrated when we only are promoting capacity, because again, capacity doesn't mean anything unless we can actually do that number of tests per day. And even 85,000 isn't going to get us that far. That's why we're going to need other options possibly, or we will, to be able to move us past and get more and more individuals tested in this state. I don't know if you would have any other comments, Dr. Raymond.
No, I agree with you. We're not quite at the sweet spot. We have enough tests to test symptomatic patients, but not to go out into communities and do a large study. I do think that Governor Evers pledged to test 10,000 employees and occupants of long-term care facilities every week is a good step forward.
Yep.
I can get one last question in, and Tim, your perspective might be helpful here. We had some questions about the idea of using the number of positive cases as a gating criteria for reopening the economy. Well, it's still going up, but how much of that is related to performing more tests?
Go ahead, Dr. Raymond or Lisa, and Chris, we've got time. We can put in a couple more questions if we got them.
Yeah, the reason we're following the percentage of positive tests is that when we increase testing capacity and the number of tests administered, it might artificially inflate the number of positive cases we have. And so I think that was included in President Trump's plan originally as sort of a mitigating test. On the other hand, it's really hard for us to see any trends as we're increasing our testing capacity. And as you've seen, there's a lot of variability in the percentage of positive tests we have both in Wisconsin and Milwaukee. So maybe another criteria might be better.
Yeah, I think looking at more hospitalizations, and Dr. Raymond certainly is impacted more on this. I think more looking at that, I do have a concern on Governor Evers' plan for 14 days. We have to show a decline, because if you don't have enough of your denominator going up, I mean, you may always stay above that 14-day line, right? And we're not going to be seeing the decline for 14 straight days. So I think there does, I agree, have to be another criteria rather than just that one.
Dr. Raymond, we had a question about the video that you showed. Is that just one machine, or is that several different stations that process multiple tests at once?
Those are all connected. That's a long line that spans through 4 different rooms.
How many tests can that machine process at once?
Good question. I don't know how many wells there are, but the capacity of the machine is supposed to be about 300 an hour.
We also had a question about a story that's getting a lot of attention today about research at Los Alamos about a mutation of the virus. Do you know anything about this?
I do. There's a mutation in the spike protein that may give the virus, that particular mutant virus, a competitive advantage over other mutations. Whether that gives the virus an advantage in terms of more virulence or more toxicity to human beings hasn't been established.
Lisa, maybe one last question for you. I think you mentioned that you had some interesting discussions about a vaccine earlier today. Is there anything you can share about that?
Well, we're going to be presenting at our annual member meeting, Johnson & Johnson as well as FluGen. I think with the key, what I think is, and I mentioned it briefly, is that these pharmaceutical companies, for them to be making the investment of already manufacturing these vaccines, that's never done. The process is you go through the clinical trials, you determine safety and efficacy. I mean, this takes like 8, 10, 12 years. And then you decide to manufacture, right? They're jumping straight to manufacturing to be able to, and then doing the clinical trials simultaneously, that then if it all passes, if it does prove safety, efficacy, and some things, you know, they probably won't be fully able to understand whether it's good for a year, 6 months, whatever it may be, but that if it does prove effective, and we have a lot of shots on goal right now, there's a lot of different ways that vaccines are going to come out, like FluGen's through the nose, others will be shots. But if they're effective, if they can show that in safety, they've already manufactured and they can get out millions of vaccines right away. And so a credit to, you know, the government, I know, is also helping support, but a credit then to the government as well as our pharmaceutical companies. And we have, just again, a credit to Wisconsin, we have that manufacturing, some of that's being done with Catalent here in the state. So it's great. We have a lot of API biological manufacturers in the state. That's a big part of our economy.
Well, good. Lisa, thank you very much for that insight and testing, and appreciate the opinion on what we need to do to move forward. Dr. Raymond, as always, thank you for your update. We'll be joined tomorrow by Mike Lovell, the president of Marquette University, to talk a little bit about how COVID-19 is going to impact the future of education and higher education. So have a safe afternoon, and thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Lisa. Thanks, Tim.
Appreciate it.